The alley smelled like rain-soaked concrete and old metal, the kind of place people crossed the street to avoid even in daylight. And now, under a flickering street lamp, a black man with blood on his hands stood frozen in the center of it, holding the limp body of a white female police officer whose chest rose in shallow, uneven spasms. Her radio hissed with static, her badge pressed cold against his forearm, and from the far end of the block a voice shouted sharp and panicked, "Drop her! Step away from the officer!" As squad car lights bled red and blue across brick walls and dumpsters, painting him exactly how they expected to see him before a single question was asked. To anyone watching, the story was already written. Tattooed arms, dark skin, a dying cop, and a man who looked like he belonged in handcuffs or a body bag long before he belonged in the truth of what was happening. He could feel it in the way the air tightened, in the way hands hovered over triggers, in the way. No one yelled for an ambulance first. He adjusted his grip so her head wouldn't hit the pavement, even though he knew that movement alone could get him killed. And for half a second the entire city seemed to lean forward, waiting to see whether he would run or fall exactly into the role they had already chosen for him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The man's name was Marcus Hale, though almost no one in that circle of flashing lights would have used it, not out loud and not kindly, because to the police department he was a file number, a rumor, a whispered warning passed between precincts, the kind of name rookies were told to remember if they wanted to make it home alive. He was known as a mafia boss, a street king, a predator with influence that stretched through back rooms and back alleys. And tonight, every assumption they had ever made about him settled like a verdict before a trial. Marcus knew exactly how this looked, knew the math that was being done in their heads. Black man plus uniformed woman equals threat, equals justification, equals another body chalked onto asphalt with a statement that said, "Officer feared for their life." His arms were burning from holding her weight, maybe 130 pounds of gear and muscle and failing breath, and he could feel her pulse fluttering weakly against his wrist, counting seconds that no one else seemed interested in saving. "Please," someone yelled, not to him but about him. "Don't let him move." As if stillness itself was suspicious, as if mercy had to be restrained before it became dangerous. A bottle clattered somewhere behind a fence. A homeless man's voice cracked saying he saw someone else run, and the words died the moment an officer snapped back, "Shut up." Because that version of events didn't fit the picture they preferred, Marcus lowered himself carefully, one knee touching the wet ground, not in surrender but in instinct, angling his body to shield her from the guns now fully raised. And in that instant he understood something with brutal clarity. No matter what he did next, the city had already decided who he was. And the only question left was whether anyone would bother to notice that the cop everyone was ready to avenge was still alive, because the man they hated refused to let her die. Marcus Hale stayed exactly where he was, one knee in the wet grit of the alley, one arm locked under the officer's shoulders, because he understood something the moment the guns came up and the shouting began. Movement was no longer about physics, it was about perception, and perception had never been kind to men who looked like him. The officers saw the tattoos first, then the muscle, then the blood on his hands. And only after that did they see the uniformed woman struggling for breath, and even then she was secondary to the threat they believed he represented. Marcus had lived his entire life inside that order of operations, judged before he spoke, sentenced before he explained, and filed away in the same mental cabinet labeled dangerous, violent, disposable. The police lights strobed across his face, and he could see his reflection in a shattered car mirror nearby, a man already reduced to a headline that had not yet been written, while radios crackled with coded urgency, and someone barked his name as if it were proof of guilt rather than an identity. To them he was not a man who had stopped to help. He was a mafia boss caught red-handed, the type they had been trained to believe did not save cops, did not kneel, did not choose restraint when escape was possible. What none of them could see was the calculation happening behind his steady eyes. The memory of every encounter where doing exactly what he was told still ended with a knee in his back or a face pressed into concrete. The knowledge that compliance did not guarantee survival when fear and prejudice were already in control. He could hear one officer say, "He is known," as if that single phrase erased every other fact, and another reply, "That is him." Like they had been waiting years for this exact image to appear. Marcus tightened his grip slightly, not out of defiance, but to keep the woman from slipping, feeling the weight of her body and the alarming irregularity of her breathing. And he spoke for the first time, his voice low and deliberate, telling them she was losing blood and needed an ambulance. But his words floated into the night without landing, drowned out by commands that had nothing to do with saving a life. Someone demanded he put his hands up, another shouted for him to lie flat, and the contradictions piled on top of each other until it was clear none of them actually expected him to comply, because compliance would mean acknowledging that he was trying to help. A flashlight beam cut across his face, lingering on the scar near his temple, the one he got years ago when a deal went wrong, and Marcus recognized the shift in posture immediately, the subtle tightening that came when the story in their heads finally felt complete. He had built his reputation in a world that rewarded decisiveness and punished hesitation, but this was not that world. And power did not belong to him here. It belonged to the men with badges who believed the alley belonged to them simply because they stood on one end of it with weapons drawn. Still, he did not let go, because letting go would mean dropping her onto cold pavement, would mean choosing his own safety over her life. And that was a line he had never crossed even when everything else in his life suggested he should. As the tension stretched and the night seemed to hold its breath, Marcus understood that the real danger was not the guns pointed at him. It was the certainty in their voices, the ease with which they had already decided that whatever happened next would be his fault, no matter how many facts had to be ignored to make that ending fit. The situation deteriorated not because anyone moved, but because the assumptions hardened, and as more patrol cars arrived, the alley filled with voices that spoke over one another in clipped commands and loaded judgments. The kind that did not ask questions because they believed answers were unnecessary. Someone called out Marcus Hale's name again, louder this time, not as identification but as accusation. And another officer muttered that this was exactly how it always went with men like him. A phrase delivered casually enough to sound procedural, as if bias had been folded into policy and laminated for daily use. A supervisor pushed forward through the line, boots splashing through shallow puddles, eyes scanning Marcus's body before ever checking the officer bleeding in his arms. And the order came down to secure the suspect first, stabilize later, because in their calculus control mattered more than care. Marcus felt the woman shift weakly, her breath hitching, and he repeated that she was fading, that her pulse was irregular, that there was an entrance wound he was trying to keep pressure on, but his voice was swallowed by the chorus telling him to get on the ground, to separate himself from the officer, to stop resisting even though he had not resisted anything at all. A body camera blinked red. Another caught the scene from an angle that framed Marcus as the center of danger rather than the barrier between life and death. And he knew those recordings would be reviewed with the same selective attention that had already erased the possibility of his innocence. A flashlight beam lingered on his hands, slick with blood that was not his, and an officer barked that it was evidence, as if the act of holding a dying person had become proof of violence rather than prevention. Behind the police line, a small crowd had gathered, faces lit by the strobe of emergency lights, whispers spreading faster than facts. And Marcus heard someone say the word execution under their breath, not in reference to the cop's condition, but to what they believed was coming for him. A man near the mouth of the alley tried again to say he saw a white male sprint past moments earlier, taller, wearing a hoodie. And the response was immediate and sharp, a command to step back, to stop interfering, to let the officers do their jobs, which in that moment meant preserving the narrative already forming. Marcus felt the pressure of gun barrels tracking his slightest adjustment, and he understood that even shifting his weight to keep the officer's head from slamming into the pavement could be interpreted as aggression. That mercy itself had become suspicious. The supervisor demanded he release her, and when Marcus said he could not without worsening her condition, the supervisor scoffed that he was not a medic, that he did not get to decide, that his role in this scene was limited to compliance and silence. The words were not shouted, they were worse than that, delivered with a flat certainty that assumed authority did not need to justify itself. And Marcus recognized that tone from courtrooms and interrogation rooms, from every place where power had been mistaken for truth. The officer in his arms groaned softly, a sound so small it was almost lost, and Marcus felt a surge of urgency. That had nothing to do with fear for himself, because he knew how close she was to slipping away and how little time prejudice left them when it decided who deserved patience. Radios crackled with requests for backup units and a perimeter, but no one seemed to be calling for trauma surgeons or a helicopter, and Marcus realized that in their rush to control him, they were gambling with her life. The tension tightened further when someone shouted that Marcus was reaching, though he was only adjusting his grip, and fingers tensed on triggers as if release were inevitable rather than optional. In that moment, the alley stopped being a place and became a verdict in progress, a space where race, reputation, and fear combined to outweigh evidence. And Marcus understood with chilling clarity that the greatest threat was not the guns aimed at his chest, but the certainty in the minds behind them. The certainty that made it easy to believe that whatever happened next would be justified because they had already decided who he was. The first crack in the certainty surrounding the scene did not come from a command or a weapon, but from a voice that trembled as it tried to be heard. A man standing just beyond the tape with rain-darkened clothes and a shopping cart full of his life, raising one hand, as if asking permission to exist, saying again that he had seen someone else run past him moments before the sirens arrived, that the person was white, tall, moving fast, and gone before he understood what had happened. The response was immediate and dismissive, an officer snapping that now was not the time, another telling him to step back and stop confusing the situation, and the man's words dissolved into the air, as if truth itself required the right appearance to be considered credible. Marcus heard it all, filing the sound away without turning his head, because he knew too well how easily witnesses like that disappeared from official accounts, how their testimony was often labeled unreliable before it was ever written down. The woman in his arms stirred faintly, her fingers twitching against his sleeve, and the small movement drew a sharp intake of breath from Marcus as he realized she was still fighting, still present, even as the people sworn to protect her argued about him. Another voice joined the first, this time from a woman near a fire escape who said she heard shouting before the gunshot, that it sounded like an argument between two men, but her words were cut off by a supervisor who raised his hand and told everyone to clear the area, to stop speculating, to let the officers do their work. And the work he meant was not investigation but containment. Body cameras continued to record, their lenses capturing angles that favored force over context, and Marcus wondered which parts would later be highlighted and which would be quietly ignored, knowing from experience that footage alone rarely changed minds already made up. He shifted his weight slightly to ease the strain on his leg, and several officers reacted as if he had lunged, their weapons tracking him in unison, a silent choreography of fear that left no room for nuance. The homeless man tried once more, voice cracking as he said he had nothing to gain by lying, that he lived there and saw what happened every night. And this time an officer stepped toward him with a hand on his chest, physically pushing him back while telling him to stay out of police business. A moment so casual and so routine it barely registered as a violation. Marcus felt anger rise, not the explosive kind that would confirm their suspicions, but a heavy, contained fury at how easily the truth was being buried under authority, how quickly the narrative had locked into place. He spoke again, louder now, telling them she was losing consciousness, that her skin was getting cold, that they were running out of time, and one officer finally glanced at the woman's face, noticing the pallor, the unfocused eyes, the way her jaw slackened, and for a brief second the script wavered. An ambulance siren wailed in the distance, still blocks away, and Marcus wondered if it would arrive in time, or if hesitation would claim another life in the name of procedure. The supervisor barked for Marcus to release her immediately, insisting they could not treat her until she was separated from him. And Marcus knew that meant placing her on the ground, exposing her wound, trusting strangers who had already decided he was expendable to suddenly prioritize her care. Behind the tape, a few phones were raised despite orders to lower them, their small screens capturing fragments of the moment, the kneeling man, the guns, the witnesses being silenced, and Marcus understood that while official reports might erase those voices, memory had a way of leaking out anyway. As the standoff stretched, the alley felt smaller, the walls closing in under the weight of unspoken assumptions, and Marcus realized that the witnesses were not just people on the sidelines but the conscience of the moment, fragile and easily crushed, fighting to be heard before the truth was sealed away by authority that had already chosen its ending. The moment stretched to its breaking point as the officer's breathing grew shallower, each rise of her chest more uneven than the last, and Marcus felt the weight of time press down harder than the guns aimed at him. Because he knew exactly what happened when moments like this tipped the wrong way, how quickly. Fear turned into gunfire, and explanations came later if they came at all. His mind drifted not by choice, but by force into memories he had buried deep, flashes of other nights under flashing lights. Other sidewalks where he had been ordered down for fitting a description that was never more specific than his skin. The sound of cuffs snapping closed when he was younger, even though he had done nothing but stand still and answer questions. The cold certainty in an officer's voice telling him that resisting was whatever they said it was. He remembered being 14, hands shaking, face pressed into asphalt that smelled just like this alley. Hearing someone say he was lucky it ended with bruises instead of bullets. As if survival itself were a favor. The present snapped back into focus when a command rang out that made his stomach drop. A supervisor shouting that if Marcus did not comply immediately they would take him down. And Marcus understood with painful clarity that compliance no longer meant safety. It meant relinquishing control over whether the woman in his arms lived or died. Her fingers twitched again, weaker this time, and she made a sound that barely qualified as a word. Something breathy and broken that only he was close enough to hear, and Marcus leaned his head closer despite the risk, his voice dropping as he told her to stay with him, to keep fighting, because help was coming even if it was slower than it should have been. A gun clicked as someone adjusted their grip, a sound so small yet so loud it seemed to echo off the brick walls, and Marcus felt a familiar calm settle over him, the kind that came only when everything else fell away and a single choice remained. He could let go, put his hands up, do exactly what they demanded, and hope that someone else would care enough to save her, or he could keep doing what he was doing and accept whatever consequences followed, knowing at least that he had not abandoned her when she needed him most. The memory of his mother's voice surfaced then, telling him years ago that character was revealed not when things were easy, but when the world dared you to be less than you were, and Marcus felt the truth of that settle into his bones. He shifted his body again, deliberately, lowering himself further so that his back was between her and the line of fire, a move that drew shouts and curses from the officers, but also froze them for a fraction of a second as they tried to process what they were seeing. Instead of rising, instead of running, instead of reaching for anything that could be mistaken as a weapon, Marcus was making himself a shield, placing his own life beneath hers in a way that did not fit the story they had already written. His knee slid on the wet ground, his muscles screaming from the strain, but he stayed there, one hand steady on her wound, the other braced against the pavement, and he spoke clearly now, not begging and not arguing, telling them that if they were going to shoot him, they could do it after an ambulance arrived, after she was breathing on her own, after the badge they claimed to honor was no longer slipping away under their watch. The words landed heavier than any shout, and for the first time since the sirens arrived, the alley went quiet enough for everyone to hear the truth beneath the fear, that the man they were ready to kill was the only reason a dying officer still had a chance, and that whatever happened next would reveal far more about them than it ever would about him. What happened next was not loud or sudden but deliberate, a shift so controlled it unsettled everyone watching because it did not follow the script they were prepared for. And as Marcus held his position with his back curved protectively over the officer, a voice came through a radio near the front of the line, sharper and more urgent than before, calling out that traffic cameras at the intersection 2 blocks north had captured movement just before the shot, a figure running hard and fast away from the alley. And for the first time since the standoff began, the certainty in the officer's posture wavered. The supervisor demanded clarification, irritation bleeding into his tone, and the reply came back strained, saying the runner did not match Marcus Hale, that the build was different, the direction wrong, and that the timestamp placed the individual leaving the scene before the first patrol arrived. Murmurs rippled through the line, quiet but undeniable, and Marcus felt the tension shift from predatory focus to defensive confusion as the story they had built began to crack under the weight of facts they could no longer ignore. Still, no one lowered their weapon, because letting go of a narrative was harder than pulling a trigger when authority had already committed to an assumption. Marcus stayed still, breathing slow and measured, because he knew better than to mistake doubt for safety. And he could feel the officer in his arms cling weakly to consciousness, her breath ragged, but present, a fragile anchor in the middle of the chaos. A paramedic unit finally pushed through the crowd, their uniforms cutting a different shape against the flashing lights, and one of them shouted that they needed access now, that the patient was crashing, and the word patient landed differently than suspect ever had. An officer hesitated, then stepped aside, and another followed, opening a narrow path that felt less like permission and more like surrender to reality. Marcus spoke calmly, explaining where the wound was, how long she had been bleeding, what he had done to slow it, and the medic listened, nodding, because in that moment competence mattered more than reputation. As the stretcher was brought forward, the supervisor ordered Marcus to back away, his voice tight with the need to regain control, and Marcus complied slowly, carefully transferring the weight so the officer did not jolt, his hands releasing only when the medic confirmed they had her. The separation was immediate and jarring, and Marcus straightened for the first time in what felt like hours, his muscles stiff, his clothes soaked through, his hands still red with someone else's blood. Weapons remained trained on him, but the angle had changed, the certainty dulled by the inconvenient truth that the dying officer was alive because he had refused to abandon her. A radio crackled again, this time with confirmation that the runner had been identified as a person of interest with prior incidents involving violence, and the alley seemed to inhale sharply, the weight of that information settling unevenly across the scene. No one apologized. No one acknowledged the hours of accusation compressed into minutes. But something essential had shifted, a recognition that the man they had treated as a threat had acted with restraint and humanity under pressure that would have broken many others. Marcus stood with his hands visible, not raised in surrender but open, because he knew the moment was fragile and that truth did not erase bias, it only challenged it. The supervisor approached him now with a different tone, clipped and formal, asking him to stay put while they sorted things out, and Marcus nodded once, because he understood the language of power well enough to know when it was retreating without admitting defeat. As the ambulance doors closed and sirens rose again, carrying the officer away from the alley and toward a chance at survival, the crowd exhaled, phones still raised, whispers spreading not about a criminal caught, but about a man who had done what was right when the system around him had done everything wrong. Marcus watched the red lights disappear down the street, aware that the night was far from over for him, but also aware that something irreversible had occurred, that the choice he made to stay had forced the truth into the open, and that whatever came next would have to contend with the fact that the story they wanted was no longer the story that existed. The truth did not arrive with an announcement or an apology. It surfaced piece by piece through radios and murmured confirmations, each fragment stripping away the version of events that had placed Marcus Hale at the center of blame, until finally a senior officer stepped forward holding a tablet, his jaw tight as he replayed footage pulled from a nearby traffic camera, the grainy image showing a different man entirely, taller, leaner, sprinting out of frame seconds after the gunshot, a man whose face never turned toward the alley because he did not need to look back. The crowd leaned in as the video looped again, and the silence that followed was heavier than any accusation, because it forced everyone to confront how confidently they had been wrong. The supervisor cleared his throat and asked for the name, and the answer came back clipped and precise, a suspect already known to the department. A white male with a history of violent encounters and a suspended license, someone who fit none of the assumptions that had driven guns toward Marcus moments earlier. A few officers shifted uncomfortably, eyes dropping, hands lowering just enough to signal retreat without admitting error, and Marcus watched it all with a stillness born not of triumph but exhaustion, because vindication did not erase what had almost happened. Someone muttered that they had moved too fast. Another said they had followed procedure, and the words sounded hollow even to the people saying them. Because procedure had not been what nearly ended a life in that alley, prejudice had. Marcus was finally addressed directly, not as a threat, but as a person, asked to state his name for the record, and when he did, clearly, and without bravado, it landed differently than before, no longer a warning but a fact. A body. Camera was turned toward him as a formality, and Marcus looked into it briefly, aware that this lens would capture a version of him that contradicted every expectation. A man who had stayed when escape was easier, who had protected a police officer while being treated as disposable. The supervisor hesitated, then spoke words that felt both necessary and insufficient, acknowledging that Marcus had not been the shooter and that his actions had likely saved the officer's life, and the admission rippled through the crowd, a quiet reckoning unfolding in real time. Marcus did not respond immediately, because he understood that this was not a moment for speeches. It was a moment for truth to sit uncomfortably where certainty had once lived. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and unraised, cutting through the noise without aggression, telling them that they saw a monster because they never bothered to see a man, that they had aimed weapons before asking questions, and that the only reason the officer was not dead was because he refused to act like the criminal they had already decided he was. The words landed hard, not because they were shouted, but because they were undeniable, echoing against brick and badge alike. No one interrupted him, not out of respect, but because there was nothing to counter what had already been proven. As additional units peeled away to pursue the real suspect, the alley slowly began to empty, leaving behind the residue of a narrative that had collapsed under its own bias. A few onlookers lowered their phones. Others kept recording, aware they had witnessed something rare, accountability forced into the open by circumstance rather than policy. Marcus was told he was free to go, the phrase delivered stiffly, and he nodded once, understanding the irony of being granted freedom he had never lost, yet nearly paid for with his life. As he walked away from the alley, the streetlights stretching out ahead of him, Marcus did not feel victorious. He felt soberly aware that the system had not changed. It had merely been exposed, and that tonight had shown how close justice came to failing simply because it decided who looked guilty before it decided to listen. The collapse did not happen with sirens or shouting, but with a slow, unmistakable unraveling as the remaining officers stood in the alley, surrounded by the evidence of their own misjudgment, radios buzzing with updates about the real suspect, while no one quite knew what to do with the man they had nearly destroyed. Supervisors spoke in lowered voices now, their authority muted by the knowledge that procedures had failed in the most public way possible, and every body camera still recording felt less like protection and more like an indictment. Word spread quickly beyond the alley, first through police channels, and then through the phones of bystanders who had not lowered them. Clips already circulating that showed the moment weapons were trained on a man kneeling to save a life, the moment witnesses were silenced, the moment doubt arrived too late to undo the damage. Marcus Hale remained nearby, not detained and not invited to leave, existing in a limbo that mirrored the department's own uncertainty, and he watched officers avoid his eyes as if looking at him too long would force them to confront what they had almost done. A lieutenant arrived and demanded a briefing, his tone sharp until he reviewed the footage himself, and then his posture changed, shoulders stiffening as he realized this was no longer a simple incident, but a public reckoning. Questions were asked about who issued which orders and why no one had called for immediate medical support when the officer was first found, and the answers came haltingly, wrapped in language about perceived threats and officer safety that sounded increasingly hollow against the facts. Marcus listened without comment as they debated policy failures that had real names and real consequences, thinking about how close the system had come to erasing him without consequence and how easily it would have moved on afterward. The ambulance update came through then, confirming that the officer was alive and in surgery, and the relief that rippled through the group was complicated by the knowledge that her survival was owed to the very man they had treated as expendable. A few officers finally looked at Marcus with something like shame, while others doubled down on silence, retreating into professionalism as a shield against accountability. A sergeant ordered the scene cleared, and tape was removed, but the sense of collapse lingered, because systems did not simply reset when the perimeter came down. Internal Affairs was notified, not as a formality, but as a necessity, and the phrase review process was spoken aloud with an edge of inevitability that suggested careers were about to be examined under a harsher light. Marcus was approached by an officer tasked with taking a statement, the request delivered carefully, almost respectfully, and Marcus agreed, because he understood that his words now carried weight whether he wanted them to or not. He spoke plainly, recounting what he saw and what he did, leaving out emotion because the facts alone were enough, and as he spoke he could see the discomfort deepen, because his account did not paint him as an anomaly, but as a mirror reflecting the department's own reflexes. Outside the alley, news vans began to arrive, their lights joining the fading patrol cars, and the story took on a life far beyond the block where it began, framed not as a crime stopped, but as a bias exposed. Marcus declined interviews, knowing that spectacle would only cheapen the truth. But the images did not need his commentary to speak for themselves. By the time he finally walked away, the alley behind him was no longer a place of accusation, but a cautionary tale, and within the department walls, quiet conversations had already begun about suspensions, policy changes, and damage control. Yet beneath all of it lay an unspoken understanding that something essential had broken, that authority had been forced to confront its own fragility, and that the system had not merely failed one man and one officer that night. It had revealed how close it always was to doing so again. By morning the alley was clean again, rain washing away the last dark traces on the pavement. But the night refused to stay contained within police reports and press statements. Because stories like this did not fade quietly, they lodged themselves in memory and resurfaced wherever people argued about justice and fear. Marcus Hale watched the coverage from a distance. Not from pride, but from a sober understanding that the narrative was no longer his to control, seeing images of himself kneeling replayed beside headlines that struggled to reconcile who they thought he was with what he had done. The officer he saved remained in critical condition for days before stabilizing, and when word finally came that she would survive, the relief was accompanied by an uncomfortable truth that could not be softened by gratitude alone, that her life had been preserved in spite of a system that nearly sacrificed two people to protect its assumptions. Internal reviews were announced, language carefully chosen to suggest accountability without promising transformation, and Marcus listened as officials spoke about lessons learned and policies under review, phrases he had heard before, and learned not to mistake for change. Still, something had shifted, because the witnesses had not been erased this time, their recordings and testimonies circulating far beyond departmental control, forcing conversations that could not be redirected with procedure alone. Marcus was asked more than once why he stayed, why he did not run when he had every reason to believe the guns would fire, and his answer never changed, because it did not need embellishment. He said he stayed because leaving would have meant letting someone die, and because he was tired of living in a world where survival required abandoning his humanity. The simplicity of that truth unsettled people more than anger ever could, because it exposed how low the bar had been set for him and how easily it had been missed. Weeks later, when the officer was able to speak publicly, she acknowledged that she remembered fragments of the night, the sound of his voice close to her ear, the steady pressure that kept her alive, and her statement did more than thank Marcus. It forced the department to confront the reality that the man they had feared embodied the values they claimed to uphold. Marcus did not attend press conferences or accept invitations to debate, choosing instead to return to his life with a clarity sharpened by what he had witnessed, knowing that justice did not arrive all at once, but in moments that demanded courage without guarantees. The alley became a reference point in discussions about bias training and use of force, cited in meetings and classrooms as an example of how quickly assumptions could escalate toward tragedy. And while Marcus understood that policy could not erase prejudice overnight, he also understood the power of an undeniable example. In quieter moments he reflected on how close the city had come to losing its moral footing, how easily fear had overridden reason, and how the difference between a life saved and a life lost had rested on a decision to see a person rather than a stereotype. The story ended not with punishment or praise, but with a question that lingered long after the cameras moved on. A question about how many times similar choices were made without witnesses, without footage, without someone willing to stay kneeling in the rain. And in that unresolved space lay the true message of the night, that justice did not fail with noise and spectacle. It failed quietly when people decided who looked guilty before they decided to listen, and that the most dangerous weapon was not a gun, but a prejudice left unchallenged, waiting for the next dark alley and the next life caught in its shadow.